Good evening. You are listening to Framed and Bound, a podcast about movies set in the literary world. My name is Tobias Carroll, and this episode I'll be talking with fellow writer Drew Buxton, author of the short story collection So Much Heart. We are going to be getting metafictional this time, with a discussion of the 2002 film Adaptation, which is about writer Charlie Kaufman's efforts to adapt Susan Orlean's book The Orchid Thief for the screen. It was written by Kaufman, directed by Spike Jonze, and stars Nicolas Cage, Meryl Streep, Chris Cooper, Tilda Swinton, Brian Cox, and Maggie Gyllenhaal. This movie has just a scarily good cast. It is something that will come up a few times over the course of this episode. If you're looking to watch Adaptation, you can rent it digitally at the usual spots, and there is also a Blu-ray available through Shout Factory. I had not seen Adaptation in many, many years. I can remember seeing it actually, I think, in the theater with some friends. And then for whatever reason, like, I liked it, but I don't think I was always like, oh yeah, I've seen that, I've done that, and I had not watched it in a very long time, and so I'm very grateful to that you suggested this, because I think this is it's a very interesting film, and I think it's like both from how it depicts the art of writing to the sort of styles to the fact that it was, it's arguably a writer and director team up, following up sort of a cult hit, and kind of zigging where perhaps it could zag. And I think it's also in the phenomenon. I've had this on my brain because of some very different films that I'll probably get into in a second, but it's also, the challenge of, like, how do you make a successful film adaptation of a book that, does not necessarily lend itself to adaptation at all.
I first saw it, I think, a few years after it came out. It's crazy. It came out 22 years ago.
I don't think about it, honestly. I really don't.
Yeah, I was like a teenager when I saw it, and I just thought it was, I don't know that I fully appreciated it for all the things that were going on. I just thought, like, it was funny, and the acting, like, I only knew Chris Cooper from October Sky, I think. And then it just being totally blown away by him in this. And then, like, I would say, like, it probably took several viewings for everything to sort of click about how, the movie itself becomes a thriller, and kind of the things are, just kind of the meta level of meta, kind of, it makes my head hurt a little bit. But
it definitely, I will say, and this is probably me, sometimes I just miss stuff that's completely obvious, and, like, I was obviously aware that it is called Adaptation and it is about adapting,
right.
But it completely, until I watched it this time, I was just like, oh right, and there's this whole other subplot about how plants adapt to their conditions, and that's
Right.
like the big thing, and it's just like, right, yeah, that's certainly there, as well.
Right.
Obviously, if your three names above the title are Nicolas Cage and Meryl Streep and Chris Cooper, you're going to have some good acting, but just
Right.
the sheer cast of this, where it's just like, because I think this is the first thing I ever saw Judy Greer in, who has now gone on to just,
Right.
be absolutely, fantastic in everything. Was, I think, one of, like, Maggie Gyllenhaal's first, although I think this came out right around the same time as Secretary, where it was more of a leading role for her, but it's like,
Right.
she's clearly having a blast in this. Ron Livingston as his agent, who is just spectacularly terrible.
Yeah.
Brian Cox as Robert McKee. I mean,
Right.
just, it's actually the one, at some point I need to look up, because the actress who plays the Charlie Kaufman's sort of the woman he's yearning for, Cara Seymour, who I was, like, sort of surprised at, in the sense that she's, obviously Tilda Swinton as the executive. Yeah. I'm a little bit bummed now watching this, because it's like, I also feel like Cara Seymour does a fantastic job in this, in the role that she's playing, and it's like,
Right.
She's like the only person in the cast of this movie who I don't feel like has gone on to just do, continue to do phenomenal work, or, be in high profile projects or whatever after this. And I don't know if that's more, I saw that she's done some stuff on stage, so maybe it's just she's been doing more stage stuff. I don't really know.
Right. Yeah, even like to me, even when I saw it for the first time, I didn't Nick Cage was, Face Off and Con Air to me.
Yeah.
And yeah, to see it, obviously this kind of versatility with the brothers. I would say this movie and Bad Lieutenant, Port Call, New Orleans were the two ones that came out a little later, but that really showed me how there's such a range of like his movies where he'll do anything for money, but he also like there are certain roles that you can't like maybe only he can do.
I mean, it's a movie where, despite the fact that even like the twins are not, even when they're, I mean, really the main way you could tell them apart physically is like one of them is Charlie is always wearing the flannel shirt and
Yeah,
Donald
yeah,
is not. But it's like they're also still it's both kind of it's I don't want to say a show offy role, because he's
yeah,
not, it's not really like, I have seen Nicolas Cage go huge, and like that is not what he's doing here, but it is him finding the little ways in which it's like you keep having to forget that it's like, no, this is one dude like
yeah,
interacting with a blank space and then coming back in and filling in the gaps later, and like, yeah.
yeah. His portrayal. I mean, just from the opening, I think this could go probably really poorly with a worse actor, but just that pure vein of anxiety. And I think not
Yeah.
not all writers are necessarily self-hating and anxious, but I think he really captures that. It's an archetype for a reason.
Yeah.
But
I believe, and I might be getting this wrong, but I remember seeing this with a friend, and I think the whole scene where like he's being criticized for wearing a flannel shirt. I'm pretty sure I
right.
was wearing a flannel shirt when I watched it, and I think
Right.
my friend may have like just been like, "Oh no." Um,
Yeah, his I mean he uses the word paralyzed in this, but do you really it's not that he's just socially inept, he's so aware of how socially inept he is, yet he can't do anything about it.
yeah,
And I think like I can relate to moments like that of like you have to say something now, like this is awkward. But yeah, just being that sort of social paralysis is so well done in this movie.
well, it's also, I think, I mean, the scene, there's the scene where he's been going to a diner and Judy Greer plays a waitress in the
Yeah,
diner, and like she's basically just making, as she's making small talk, she's like, "Oh, orchards, or sorry, orchids, I like orchids," and it's just like, "Hey, cool, you are in this profession, you clearly just make small talk with people," and
right,
he is immediately just like smitten, which is fair. Like I
right,
get, I get why you would have it, but it's also like, dude, you should not be, trying to seduce the woman who just wants to bring you pie and
right,
make small talk. Like that is not evidence of a bond between your two. And like, and it is a film in which like this is a film in which the main character is not afraid to portray his main character as like being kind of being able to be kind of a creep at times, which I
yeah. He's definitely aware, but he starts apologizing before he even actually asks her out. So he's so
yeah,
like he's aware of what he's doing, but I mean, I think the characters, Susan and him are just the loneliness is so palpable. Like he's just driven by he does these things that he's aware he shouldn't be doing, but he doesn't know any other way to
yeah,
kind of interact and try to sort of alleviate the loneliness.
yeah. There's a great shot at the very end of the film where I guess I will put in a spoiler alert for a 22-year-old
Yeah.
film. After his brother has died in the swamps, which is just such a ridiculous. I mean, I want to talk about that in a little bit, but
Yeah.
like, but there's a scene of Charlie sitting down alone, and it's like, because, and again, I think this is speaks to Spike Jonze's talents as a director, like, because he has shown you so many shots of the two of them in the frame, together opposite one another doing different things. It's like there's that first scene where he's sitting down to eat a meal alone, and the other side of the table where his brother's been, in previous scenes is absent, and it's just like you feel that loss really acutely, even
Right.
even given like even given the fact that like the final act of this film is just absurdly silly, like when you attempt to describe it,
Right.
you know, and ends with Chris Cooper and involves Chris Cooper being eaten by an alligator. But it's also like, I think Spike Jonze is a fantastic director. I think Charlie Kaufman is a fantastic writer. And like I don't, and obviously with the cast that you have in this too, like it somehow manages to both be a parody of itself that is still like, for all of that, like the scene where like calls his mother and has to tell her, his brother has died, is like is
Right.
genuinely moving. Like,
Yes.
despite the fact
Yes.
that it's like this film has taken this turn into like the worst, the kind of the a parody of what an adaptation of
Right.
this would be like. Which just, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even during that, while it's happening, they're hiding in the swamp um, and that just that line of "You're not what you love, or you're not what loves you, you're what you love." And I still don't know that I totally know what that means, but that sort of moment between the two of them, like, whatever happens, it is touching. I think it balances all these things at once. Like, I mean, I was also just, I mean, being kind of dumb at when I first saw it. Like, it didn't totally, I didn't appreciate the ridiculousness of the third act when I first saw it. I was just kind of along for the ride, and it didn't feel that jilting,
Yeah.
uh, which is impressive.
I was watching this a little bit more now with that scene of Charlie and Robert McKee in the bar where he's, and I don't think I had quite gleaned it until this watching through, just like how much, you know, McKee says. By the way, I love the detail that apparently Robert McKee's choice to play himself was in fact Brian Cox, um, which which is also perfect. Although it also, I'm still baffled by the fact that like I don't think Brian Cox has aged. Like he just
Right,
seems to have like reached a point where he just looked like he's like in his 60s, and he reached that like decades ago. And like just like some people, it's like when I look at pictures of him in Succession or in this or like 25th Hour, it's like, wait, those are 20 years apart, because I think just he just seems to have like
yeah,
achieved this level of sort of gravitas. The fact that he says like, well, the final act, if you knock it out
right,
with the third act, it'll, but also, and for all that, it's like, oh, okay, what, knowing what's coming, it's like, oh, I kind of see what you're doing there. But
right.
it's also funny that he's like, don't you dare do a Deus Ex Machina. And I'm like, I'm not sure that that kind of seems like the alligators that he, Chris Cooper, kind of fall into that. Like, I don't know.
I think the movie, in a lot of ways, I think about it, and I think a lot of writers think about this, but like, where's the line between, art and being, being a hack, and, am I a hack? And, it's when Charlie's he taught when he speaks up during the seminar, when I see it, and I kind of like, yeah, like that would be great. Then it's almost like that attitude is almost has a contempt for the reader or the watcher. It's like, just where's the balance of, helping out, or is this a piece of entertainment, or just kind of this masturbatory art thing? It really plays with that well.
There's never a character who says this outright, but I think it's a little bit of the subtext of some of the scenes in which the Tilda Swinton's character, who's the studio executive,
Hmm.
because you see her in meetings both with Susan Orlean, played by Meryl Streep, where she's talking to her about, we want to buy the rights to this. I think at the time it's just an article, and she's sort of under contract to expand it into a book.
Right.
This also reminds me that I've never actually read the Orchid Thief, which I really
I
should.
haven't
Um,
either.
but like, and she and Susan Orlean seems a little bit flummoxed by the idea of like, why would why would you want to adapt this? And then the scenes with Charlie Kaufman, where he's being hired to do it, there's also just this question of like, can you actually adapt, because it's there are the scenes where you see all of like, the book ends with this meditation on loss and kind of what you don't see, which is the sort of thing that you can do very easily in a book,
Right.
but it's really difficult to show that on film. And it's never quite said, but it's just like, maybe there's also the question of like, are there just certain things that like just don't work in another, difficult to adapt them because like you can't really adapt them.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I think it's interesting that he's not trying to adapt like a masterpiece, like that, like he reads like the New Yorker or the New York Times review of kind of how it's flawed in a way that a lot of New Yorker, articles that get turned into books, they kind of just get puffed up into this bigger thing.
Yeah.
So he's struggling with that too, I think, which is interesting. But yeah, I don't know that we get kind of the answer that you're talking about. Yeah, I guess I haven't totally thought about it in that way, but yeah, can't really think of where we land with that.
Yeah. It's interesting to me for two reasons, or for a couple of reasons. Where there's a moment in this where I don't know if you've ever seen. Did you ever see Michael Winterbottom's film adapting Tristram Shandy?
No, no, I haven't.
Because that's another case of, I feel like, a film setting out to adapt. I mean, it's the Susan Orlean book is a fairly slim work of nonfiction, and Tristram Shandy is, this centuries old.
Right, right,
uh and part of that, the challenge of doing that is like it becomes sort of this increasingly ornate, it's a film about an attempt to film Tristram Shandy, but then there are also these layers within that where like there are like scenes that are basically turn out to be anxiety dreams from different characters and everything else, and it's kind of
right.
and I thought that was a really, I thought that was a really interesting thing to look at, and I think it's an interesting thing to consider. Like, there was something in the water in the, in the first decade of the current century of like filmmakers going, how do I know this, I know I'm being told that this can't really be adapted, but maybe it could be.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think maybe it's just the approach that some people take is like not, I mean, this is kind of an obvious answer, but I think like The Shining, the movie doesn't really care about the book that much.
yeah,
And I think that's why it's so successful, right? I mean, it's like if you can kind of if you're married to the book, then I think it's just never gonna transfer over well. It's an interesting thing to think about.
yeah, I agree with that. Like, it's frustrating. I mean, it's like, I understand why Stephen King, kind of famously was
Right.
upset with with Kubrick for what he did, but I also think, what was the was it was it Raymond Chandler who said something? Someone asked him like, are you ever upset about your film, how your films were adapted for the screen? And he kind of pointed to a shelf behind him and was like, the books are still right here. Like, they're,
Right,
that's
right.
they're they haven't changed. If somebody adapts it, like, that's their business, but like, the books are the books.
Sure,
which
sure.
which just seems like a much healthier attitude to have than, it's
Yeah, it's interesting, like with Stephen King, like his response to that is interesting because he kind of famous for like, selling film rights to the unknown filmmakers for like $1 just to give them a chance.
yeah,
And like, I don't, there aren't too many good, I'd say, like good Stephen King adaptations.
yeah.
But yeah, so I think maybe it's just an ego thing with Kubrick that there's just sort of an arrogance to the Shining movie that maybe offended him. But
Well, and I think I've also seen like some that it's been pointed out that like in the novel, Jack Torrance is a much more sympathetically portrayed like man
right,
struggling with alcoholism, and that character was very important to King because of the autobiographical elements, and so the fact
right,
that he's just portrayed as just kind of a shit from the outset in the film
right.
is, I get it, but it's also kind of like, well, then maybe, you shouldn't have sold the the film rights to that one.
Yeah,
uh I mean, no disrespect to Stephen King,
right,
and it seems like in the years since then he has also just done a lot more with like being more selective with, like, I mean, the fact that Mick Garris has adapted like several of his works, like, and he seems to be very, very satisfied with that. So it's like, all right, cool. Like,
yeah.
um,
I think he's just kind of chilled out in general, but
yeah,
yeah, I think
I,
he's living the life. So
I kind of love that this, it begins with what is purports to be behind the scenes footage from the set of Being John Malkovich, which is
Yeah.
not this actually on the set of Being John Malkovich. And then, it moves from this very sort of, this is actually happening, this is behind the scenes, to,
Right.
completely ridiculous denouement. But it's interesting to me, and the Spike Jonze Charlie Kaufman pairing did Being John Malkovich, they did this, and then they kind of each both seem to have gone their separate ways.
Right.
And it's interesting to look at this film, especially in light of, I think, less Jones's stuff, because I mean, Where the Wild Things Are and Her, I really like both of those films, but they're not necessarily reckoning with, I think some of the themes that Kaufman was clearly reckoning with in this.
Right.
I mean, in Synecdoche, New York, you have, I think, a lot of those same questions about the logistics of making ambitious works of art and what works in one medium and what works in another. And then you have I'm Thinking About Ending Things, which also kind of feels like an attempt to adapt basically an unadaptable literary work, which
Right. Right.
I had not read that until after I saw the film, and I was kind of surprised at how it both, did and did not. It sort of seemed very faithful in certain places and very, very, and less so
Right.
in other places, including a really weird riff on a beautiful. There are these really weird riffs in that film about like Ron Howard's filmography, which I'm still like a little like I'm like okay, cool. You you, you do you, Charlie Kaufman. But yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely easy to see how this movie led to Synecdoche.
Mhm.
I mean, I remember like Roger Ebert called it, the best movie of the decade, and when it came out like 2009, and it is like I mean, it's about sort of lack of compromise with art, and then the film itself is pretty. I mean, one thing about Kaufman is just like how ambitious and brazen like his stuff is,
Yeah.
and seemingly uncompromised. So yeah, that theme of that. I mean, like the Kaufman with, why can't we just have a movie about flowers? And I felt like, I mean, to bring it to writing, like I've wanted to write about, like I've written about like professional wrestling and a lot, and it's like I think everyone should be as interested in it as me. And like it's like, no, you have to include this, human element, this like personal angle. So I feel
Yeah.
like in some ways, like with creative nonfiction, that whatever you're writing about, is especially in like the current kind of current state of things, you need that personal narrative. But yeah, part of me is always just like, I just want to write about wrestling.
Yeah.
Why aren't you guys interested? Yeah.
Because wrestling is absolutely fascinating. The other thing that I've had on my brain a little bit lately is just the challenge of adapting sort of unadaptable works more broadly, because I have been getting, this is actually not true. I haven't been getting into the work of this guy because I've still only seen two of his films,
Okay.
partially because there's a now deceased Polish director named Wojciech Has, who adapted Bruno Schulz's short fiction as the film called the Hourglass Sanatorium. He also adapted the manuscript found in Sargasso as this like 3 hour long black and white film in the 60s, which apparently was like Jerry Garcia's favorite film. And like when you look at like who, like, it's like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, David Lynch, and it's like, and then you watch
Right.
it and you're like, okay, yeah, this makes complete sense. But it's really interesting. And then when I was looking him up on Wikipedia, he had also adapted James Hogg's, and I'm going to blank on something memoirs of a justified sinner. And it's just,
Okay.
and I'm watching and I'm like, okay, so clearly, again, this is a guy who is just attracted to the challenge of like, how do I bring something that, has no business being adapted for the screen to the screen? I mean, like
Right.
his Bruno Schulz adaptation is phenomenal, but it's like it's like being stuck inside of a dream for 2 hours,
Right.
which I mean mostly as a compliment, but it's also very disorienting because it'll just be like, the main character will like walk behind will like go under the covers of a bed and suddenly he's like transported to a completely different, to a completely different location. And then I was revisiting the Shells book after the fact, and I'm like, oh right, I was like, oh, you must have taken some liberties. And then I'm like, no, this is actually like
Uh,
pretty faithful. It's just like,
Right.
but you can do those kind of weird jarring transitions a lot easier in a novel, because you could just be like, and then he opened a door and was there, and whereas there has to be
Right.
like a physical space to get from one place to the other. So
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like I mean, I certainly don't fully appreciate kind of what goes into it. Like I'm sure there are some of the masters of adaptation who I just don't, I don't even know their names, or most people don't. I mean, I think one challenge is someone like just who's played around with, screenplays and stuff. Like, how do you even like, trying to turn like a story, like a short story of mine into a short screenplay is like, how do you deal with exposition?
yeah,
How do you find where to put, especially when you have you have a first person narrator who's just directly just talk to the reader, and then you take that away. You don't want to have a ton of voiceover. That's it,
yeah.
kind of ties into adaptation, but yeah, I've just seen that as just such a big challenge.
What has your process been like for that, when you have tried to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways, like I've is spreading it as thin as possible, but like I don't know that I've totally figured out, I mean, there's all like the little tricks, but they might be, I mean, maybe they're hacky, but just like, you have newspapers, you have the TV, you have dialogue, and can you make, I mean, obviously like they can be done really poorly where it's just purely expositional dialogue that just sounds terrible and it's just stuffed in there. But I think that can be done with a light touch. I had one like a speculative story that I wrote a screenplay about, and it's like I think the more that the rules of that world kind of differ from our reality, the more you have to explain things to the viewer. So I think that became really challenging. But yeah, I mean maybe yeah, I don't know that I totally figured out. There probably is some hacky expositional dialogue, but
But I feel like that's the challenge, and I feel like this is just a challenge, especially when you're writing speculative or science fictional work in general, is like, if you are writing about people who live in like a futuristic technological culture, it's like they take a bunch of this, like if I'm going for a ride in my car, I'm not going to be like, well,
yeah,
put the key in the key,
yeah,
and then that did this to the, and then it's like, no, I'm
right,
just like, he got in the car and he went to a place, and
right.
didn't think about how the magic four-wheeled vehicle worked at all.
Right.
Which,
Yeah, no, it's a challenge. I mean, I think maybe I could be more kind of deliberate in how I watch adaptations and, versus the book and, how are they doing it and is it working? Yeah.
yeah, it's always a challenge. And it's like I went to school to study film many, many, many years ago, and I remember it took a very long time for me. Like there was a period where it got very hard for me to watch a movie and just enjoy it, because I was
Hmm.
constantly thinking about like, well, how are they doing that? How are they doing that? How are they doing that?
Right.
Um, and it got very difficult to just be like, because one of the reasons I like going to the movies is because I like to not have to think about that. And I enjoy going to movies in theaters in part because it's like I like being able to just be completely overwhelmed by like
Right.
that giant image in front of me, and I can just kind of surrender to that for, an hour and a half to 3 hours.
Hmm.
That like is a little harder at home and whatever else.
Sure.
Um,
I think, yeah, in some ways, like reading fiction is a lot hard, can be harder for me to enjoy, right? Your mind's always working. Like, what are they doing? If they're doing, like, you might be critical, or just if you're in awe of something, you kind of want to figure it out. And
yeah,
but like for me, movies have mostly just still been like just kind of this magical thing. I don't understand how they work, and I can just enjoy them. Um, but I have a little in dabbling with screenwriting. I'm actually teaching an intro to film class this coming semester, and I think it's fun because I am very much like a student, and I'm kind of cramming for it, and it's kind of scary.
yeah,
So I'm hoping that it doesn't kind of ruin the experience in a way. I mean, there are things that I've come to appreciate that are easier in film, right? Like how do you do like when you're doing fiction, like an argument, I think can be really hard to write, right?
Yeah.
And then like I just see like scenes where people are screaming over each other in a movie, and I'm just like it just works so much better on film. So you kind of get to appreciate kind of the advantages and disadvantages of each.
And I know it's also, I think, in at least one of the trailers for it, but the scene in this film, um I weirdly, I think this is a weird thing to say, and I don't know, this is a bold declaration that I'm making very off the cuff, and I might a week later just be like, oh no, I was totally wrong. But I think ironically, it is a lot easier to depict writer's block on film than it is in prose. And I think, I mean, one of these days this podcast is going to cover Barton Fink, which is
Oh yeah,
maybe
great.
the the apex of that. But I think
Sure.
the scene of Charlie Kaufman in front of his typewriter, where he's just like, coffee would help me think, and then he's like, coffee and this
Yeah.
would help me think, and it's just like, oh my god, this is absolutely me, just like, but no, the conditions have to be totally right for me to, begin typing, and
Right.
it's just like, no, but also, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
this is very, very true. uh
I definitely felt you kind of feel that. It was like a visceral feeling, I think, watching that, like him in front of the blank page just being so menacing and like he's trying to write and he has writer's block in the rest of his life. I think it can be hard when your life is kind of fucked up. Like you have
yeah,
all this other things going on too, and like things are not ideal, but you're supposed to kind of block that out and focus on this thing. I mean, and he's the thing is like he's successful and like Susan's successful
yeah,
and they're still, I think like as writers, I'm kind of rambling, but as writers, you kind of fall into the trap of like, oh, if I'm successful, that's kind of this endpoint where I'll be happy, but it's like they're still them, they can't escape themselves. And then compared to like LaRoche, who's like, and Donald, I guess, who have, I mean, he calls Donald oblivious, but they're both just like they know who they are.
yeah,
They're, they don't have the money or success, but like I mean, that's kind of a pretty clear contrast that they're trying to do,
yeah.
um, but it's interesting. Yeah.
I don't know if you ever saw the movie Identity with John
Uh,
Cusack, and
oh yeah, yeah.
it was kind of, I remember that came out not long after this, and someone pointed out that, like, and I'm going to be spoiling Identity, so if spoilers for a 20 something year old movie as well. Um, there was one, it came out in the wake of this, and someone was like, yeah, it's basically Donald Kaufman's screenplay The Three, but
Yeah.
like man, I I think I'm still sort of angry at Identity, because I was just like, yeah, I that I kind of hated that twist. Although weirdly, I think that was James Mangold, who has like since gone on to, make a number of very, very good movies.
Yeah.
Which is just like, oh, it's just like whatever, like, if I might quote to quote Billy Bob Thornton in Bad Santa, can't all be winners.
Yeah. I mean, that's where my mind goes with like the three is like that. Surely that is, and I didn't think of identity, but I was like, that has to exist in some form. Maybe like one notch less ridiculous,
Yeah,
um, but you also kind of appreciate the just saying sort of fuck it with like the concept, and there's a certain like Donald, so he's so free, he's like, I think that, I've like dismissed, always you can be kind of super like hyper aware of like, oh, that's a dumb idea. And then like Donald just he can go anywhere. At some point he's going to think of something brilliant because he'll chase every
yeah.
idea.
Taking the final act, as it is, it's like, it is fundamentally, Donald is ultimately the one who kind of is able to crack the mystery, even if it does ultimately also doom him. Which it I actually just have to say, there's a scene late in the film where Donald, we're watching Nicolas Cage play Donald Kaufman impersonating Charlie Kaufman, and it's
Yeah.
just like, Oh, it's so good. It's so good. Like, this is just such like, in terms of just watching actors. I mean, even I've been watching the current season of Only Murders in the Building is on, and it's like
Okay.
it's been fun to watch Meryl Streep in that, and it's been fun to watch her do comedy more. But like, it's like the the scenes in which Meryl Streep is stoned off of like the plant extract and
Right.
is like looking at her feet are just hilarious. And like,
Yeah.
but also there's like the tenderness that she and Cooper have. Like, there's just so much, like, just like, for all that, like, this is a film where, I feel like for a lot of people the combination of writer and director was the draw. Like,
Yeah.
there's just there is just so much pleasure in just watching a shockingly talented cast just like get to do really, really interesting things for
Yeah.
part of 2 hours.
Yeah. I mean, I think Meryl Streep just nails that. Like, yeah, like finding that balance. Like, she's uncomfortable with LaRoche, and like also very drawn to him. She portrays being out of your element so well. I mean,
Hmm.
I think that's really enforced by that, the scene with kind of this, I guess, elite New York publishing circle, New Yorker, and they're just, comically like, condescending or pretentious. And,
Yeah,
I don't, not that I like know that world that well, but it did seem to kind of, to ring true. And
yeah.
but she's also a little uncomfortable with the way they're talking about him too. So yeah, she just finds the perfect balance.
With LaRoche, because it's like he initially comes off as like this borderline hoarder who just has all this stuff in the van and his front teeth
Right.
are knocked out. But it's also like you start to realize, like, just through their conversation, it's like, oh no, he is incredibly intelligent and like
Hmm.
incredibly knowledgeable about this. He just doesn't present in sort of a traditional academic way. And then when you kind of learn, like, oh, this is how he came to lose his teeth, and maybe hasn't had them fixed just out of guilt. But like,
Right.
it's such a I mean, it's especially in that period of time. I think Chris Cooper ended up getting a lot of roles where it was like playing these very contrasty characters, whether in American Beauty or in Cuarón's adaptation of Great Expectations, which is like, speaking of like weird adaptations of literary works.
Yeah.
I which is a film I really, really like and actually really need to revisit at some point. I think it's a hugely underrated movie, but it's also, I feel like his character in that is almost like a slightly less, someone who is slightly less knowledgeable about maybe plants, but kind of has a similar like Floridian,
Yeah.
rural hard scrabble kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, like you said, the intelligence and like again, like he's not oblivious in the way I think. Well, I guess ultimately, neither him or Donald are oblivious. They show some like real introspection. Like he talks about, he says, one day I said fuck fish, which is such a funny. That's how much fuck fish. That scene just kills me.
Yeah,
But then he says that, it's not about the thing. So he's aware that like it's his interests are sort of arbitrary, and he just latches onto things and suddenly loses interest. He just sort of understands that it's important to care about something. I guess he realizes that it doesn't totally matter what that is, and then of course that's what Susan wants more than anything. But yeah, and then I mean Donald too, like he's really thought about this, what it means to be loved and to love and why that's important to him,
yeah.
which is great. But yeah, LaRoche is. I mean, I need to. Every time I watch this, I just think I've got to watch more Chris Cooper movies.
If you haven't seen it, the John Sayles film Lone Star,
Okay, I
which
haven't.
which Criterion just did a Blu-ray of it. He is phenomenally good in it. I mean, he's been in a couple of Sayles films, but it's also like an early Matthew McConaughey performance.
Okay,
It's Chris Cooper is a sort of I think sheriff in Texas, and discovers evidence of that his late father, who sort of had the same job as he did decades earlier, may have been involved in a murder, and McConaughey
Wow.
plays his
Okay.
father in Flash. So there's like a whole there's a bunch of there's sort of a two different parallel time frames. But it's also just like
Yeah.
that was kind of the first film where I saw him and I was just like, oh, this is a guy to, and I feel like he is someone who, there are some actors, some of them are supporting actors, some of them are leading actors who are just like, whenever they are in a movie, they're going to be doing something interesting,
Right. Right.
whether it's one scene or every scene, and he's absolutely in that category.
Yeah. He just sort of dominates the screen when any scene he's in.
It's so interesting that this film also juxtaposes a little bit, and I think this is also a way that kind of feels like a precursor to Synecdoche, New York, in the way that it, like, we see a lot of quote unquote reality, but we also see there are most bluntly the sort of fantasy scenes of both Judy Greer's character and Tilda Swinton's
Hmm.
character, and
Right.
even Susan Orlean, all kind of throwing themselves at Charlie Kaufman at various points, and then kind of the cutaway to him masturbating at home alone. But it's also funny that, like, the final act of this film also feels a little bit like sort of the kind of a writer's nightmare, where it's like, oh, the subject of your article, is horrified by what you've done, and they're going to stalk you through the swamp and try to kill you. uh which
Right.
definitely feels like, anxiety that I've had, and I think, probably Charlie Kaufman has also had, at some point in his life.
So like with the final, I guess the final act kind of reflecting this talk of like, salvaging a movie at the end, and it's kind of working on these different levels. Do you think it is totally pulled off in this?
For me, yeah, I do. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's a really difficult feat to pull off. I think the filmmakers do pull it off. I gotta say, I absolutely love the final shot of him going into traffic, and then the camera pulling down to just like all of the flowers that have kind of been growing up in the city, and
Right.
just that.
Right.
I think it's a fantastic choice for the last shot. I think it's maybe one of my top 10 or top 5
Oh
endings to a
wow.
film, personally. I don't know, what
Yeah,
about you?
I think it does. I mean, I think that there's a certain amount of just I think I'm kind of blown away by this movie where like what's going on takes me aback and it impresses me to the point that it can get away if it's not doing it perfectly, it gets away with it. I
Yeah,
mean, I think that the end, it kind of makes me think of, it's always the end of Mad Men, it's both like inspiring or like touching and deeply like cynical.
yeah,
I mean, this ending is like, um, he's changed as a person. He now sees the hope in life, and and it is something that he'd kind of railed against as a screenwriter previously in the movie. So it's like the movie it's like we're touched by the human story of Charlie, but it's also like a cynical ending, and that it's sort of it's also panders at the same time.
yeah. This is I don't think I'd ever thought of this before, but now that you mention it, I'm reminded of, have you seen The Player?
I don't think so.
Okay. I won't go too far into it then, because but there's some interesting similarities to how that resolves, and it's interesting because, thinking about that, that is also an adaptation, although in this case I believe Michael Tolkien, who wrote the novel that's based on, also adapted his own screenplay, or adapted his own novel for. But that's also a case of, like,
Yeah.
I think Tolkien's a fantastic writer, and Robert Altman directed it, and it's like, you know what? Again, like, I think you can pull off those shifts if you are, but you got to be really good, because if you
Yeah.
if you miss, like, it's gonna just be just an absolute catastrophe.
Yeah, like with being John Malkovich, I like if someone asked me like what I think or if it's working, like I don't I think it's so when something's so unique, it's hard to, you don't really have a framework to compare it to.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of like spellbound by it. I can't think about it as critically as I would have, I guess, that if a movie had more of a kind of standard arc.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with that completely. I mean, I think that kind of pretty much almost everything that both Spike Jonze and Charlie Kaufman have done, whether as collaborators or on their own, really kind of it's very difficult to compare any of their work to almost anything else that's out there, even some of their own. I mean, this is a very different film than Being John Malkovich, even though it
Yeah.
shares a fair amount, has a fair amount in common with it, which and on the other hand, I'm also, if there had been another film like I don't want to say Adaptation 2, but
Yeah.
it is a very difficult thing to pull off. And it's like, I'm just, in terms of the film kind of references like the New Yorker style, and it's again like I have a whole bunch of, I'm a huge fan of John McPhee's writing.
Yeah.
I have like sort of just off camera like a bunch of his books. It's like those
Yeah.
are all fantastic. Those are all fantastic books. I love them. I come back to them. McPhee is just a fascinating, prodigiously talented writer, and it's like all of those books are incredibly satisfying. And it's like I cannot think of how you would turn any of those into a rewarding film.
Right.
And again, it's like maybe you just, and again, maybe you just don't.
I mean, that makes me think of the times where I still have this like childlike joy when it comes to reading or movies. If I'm reading something that I maybe similar to the way I write or things I've read in the past, like you start kind of trying to break it down. But when something's so original and it's like, oh, I'll never be able to do something like that. Like like that has nothing to do with me.
Yeah,
Like my writer mind just doesn't latch onto it, and I just kind of become a kid just taking it in. And
yeah,
I kind of get that with Kaufman's movies. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, I absolutely, there are like plenty of writers where I read them like, I kind of see how you do this, and then there are a few where I'm like, I have no idea how your brain works,
Yeah.
and I'm always so happy when I'm just like, I have no idea how
Right.
you're doing this. This is great.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, for sure. It's a rare to or and a joy to kind of go back to
yeah.
that just innocent love of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's about all that I had that I wanted to cover. Is there anything else you wanted to?
I mean, I think something that's cool is like, and I mean, I guess we kind of get this at the end with Kaufman is a philosophy of life. Kaufman's really like, or Charlie is really preoccupied with how fucked up the world is, right? And how, focus on how his life is fucked up. And LaRoche, I wrote this before, I rewatched it this morning, and I forget that he actually says this of like, you just got to keep moving on. And like the LaRoche character fully accepts that the world is fucked and but he's still very interested in sort of participating in it. And it doesn't seem to really bother him. I mean, I think maybe that's a reflection of dealing with that, like, terrible loss of,
Yeah,
family and everything. You kind of have to like adapt. Yeah, not to, no pun intended, but yeah. And I think that's kind of the lesson, that Charlie gets at the end. Like he kind of realizes that life is worth it and he just is better able to accept that things are fucked, but he wants to, keep going. I think that's all. I think that's all I have. That's
yeah. Well, thank you for doing this. Is there anything of yours you want to promote, plug?
Well, just like I had a book come out about a year ago called So Much Heart through With an X, a small, cool indie publisher.
Yeah,
They're putting out some really cool stuff. They have Richard Chim's first book,
that was
You
just what I
Private
was thinking
Person.
of. Yeah, that I saw that they were doing that, which I'm happy to see that book coming back.
Yeah, I love that book. I remember reading it when it was first re-released by Sorry House.
Yeah,
That's probably, I think it was 7 years ago. But yeah, so another edition of that coming out with them. But yeah, if you want to pick up that book, pick up my book, that would be cool.
awesome. And that's the end of our discussion of adaptation. Maybe our next episode will be a podcast about the making of this podcast, and so on and so on, down an infinite loop to the point where there are just going to be 6 million adaptations of this podcast that are about episodes of this podcast that are about episodes of this podcast. Or maybe not. We'll be back in about a week with a conversation with Jesse Bender about the 1980 film The Shining. It's the first of 2 episodes we're going to be doing about Stephen King adaptations. Scary times call for scary movies, it seems. Quick peek behind the metaphorical curtain here. I'm recording the intro and outro post-2024 election. But this episode and the next few episodes were recorded before the election, so if you're like, this is weird, they're not really talking about a consequential presidential election on this movie podcast, that's because the election hadn't happened yet. I'm sure at some point you will know when we have begun recording post-election. It's going to be weird. But as always, thanks for listening. Our logo is designed by Mack V. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a rating on your app of choice. You can email us at framedandboundpodcast@gmail.com. Our theme music is Arvid Franzen and Eric Berg's Life in the Woods of Finland via the Internet Archive. Thank you once more for listening.